All right, good afternoon. This is the Economic Justice Law Review, Weekly Scholarship Digest, July 10th, 2020. We are the repository for scholarship relating to race, economics, and the law. I am your host, Andre L. Smith, or if you really know me, you know it's Smithy Bonton up in the building. So every week, we talk about scholarship that's published in the law reviews and journals all around the country, and also some books and other places as well. And we don't publish original scholarship. We we gather them from all these other sources and bring them to you because you're interested in race economics and the law and don't have the time to research 300 different law reviews to find the stuff that's relevant to you. Not only that, it's my belief, and we're going to show through the concept of racially asymmetric market imperfections, that practically all racially subordinating circumstances or dynamics can be described in economic terms as in the way they reflect structural racism and the way they will eventually perpetuate the racial wealth gap, even if it doesn't seem to be an economic circumstance to begin with. So the framework we're working with here is, again, racially asymmetric market imperfections. The argument is that free market fundamentalism, the free market that Gary Becker argued in Economics of Race and Discrimination, I'm sorry, the Economics of Race, that the market will eliminate racism all by itself. But that market is one that has everyone's a profit maximizer. There's perfect competition, meaning everyone can get into any market they choose or leave any market they don't like. There is perfect information about everything and everyone and everything, and that there are no transaction costs like taxes or what have you. That free market will eliminate racism. Well, we know that market doesn't exist, never existed. Not only do we know that those market structures are imperfect, we know that they're racially asymmetric, right? That racially asymmetric profit maximization, we have different levels of market engagement by race. Black folks are less encouraged to participate in the marketplace, more apt to withdraw because of racism and micro and macro aggressions. Racially asymmetric market competition in the fact that there is the racial wealth gap. There is also human and social capital gaps that perpetuate the racial asymmetric market competition. Racially asymmetric market information. I'm sorry, I need to be putting these up here. The reason, let's see, all right, hold on. With the Economic Justice Law Review, July 10th. We got new fancy stuff going on nowadays. I need to be using it. With a repository of scholarship race relating to race economics and the law. We're just talking about how racially asymmetric market failures and imperfections describe structural racism, describe how the market will perpetuate the racial wealth gap. There was asymmetric profit maximization, right? Market engagement and withdrawal. There's racially asymmetric market competition, right, in terms of capital gaps, financial capital gaps, human and social capital gaps. And that market, racially asymmetric competition happens in the market for employment and also in entrepreneurship and other instances. There is racially asymmetric market information, and we can break that down into two components. Racially asymmetric market information about Black people, or otherwise called the myth of Black inferiority. And then there is also racially asymmetric market information with respect to information available to Black people. So we're talking about miseducation and the school to prison pipeline. There are also racially asymmetric transaction costs, right? And societal externalities, and that's in terms of taxes, voter suppression, environmental racism, criminal penalties, tort damages, racialized zoning, and many other ways in which there is a Black tax, where there is higher costs or higher burdens that society places upon Black people. And again, the point of this is that Gary Becker or neo-liberal or neoclassical economists will argue that the free market will eliminate racism. So fix the market and you fix the racism. Well, we know that each of these structures are imperfect. We also know that they are racially imperfect. So, if a free market will eliminate racism, then a racially asymmetric market is pretty much guaranteed to perpetuate racism. It's going to perpetuate the racial wealth gap. So, I think Gary Becker had it backwards. It's not that the free market will eliminate racism, it's that the racism destroys your claim to a free market. And so, every article and published scholarship that we review here, we talk about the way in which that the dynamic described maintains, creates, or exacerbates those racially asymmetric market imperfections, or attempts to correct them, right? If we have something a little more positive. So, what are we featuring this week? Got three great pieces that we're featuring this week. Subramani from CUNY, City College of New York, John Jay, on new governance and progressive law enforcement. And I'm going to say that as racially asymmetric transaction costs and racially asymmetric market competition, right? She has published Productive Separations, Emergent Governance of Reentry Labor. That's in the 47th volume of Fordham Urban Law Journal, page 941, 2020. The second piece is well, the next two pieces are super fire. First, we got the great Catherine Powell out of Fordham, Camille Gear-Rich out of USC, exploring the myth of Black inferiority and voter suppression. They published a piece called The Welfare Queen Goes to the Polls. Let me say that again. Hold on. I'm sorry. I'm getting used to our new technology here. This was Shreya Subramani's Productive Separations, Emergent Governance of Reentry Labor. And now we're talking about Catherine Powell and Camille Gear-Rich. The Welfare Queen Goes to the Polls. Race-based fractures in gender politics and opportunities for intersectional coalitions. They have just published that in the 108th volume of the Georgetown Law Journal, page 105. And then the third paper, equal fire. Michael Siegel's out of Boston University on racial disparities and fatal police shootings. He writes an empirical analysis informed by critical race theory, the 100th volume of the Boston University Law Review, page 1069, 2020. So three fantastic pieces that we're going to review. Let's look backwards a little bit. Last week we talked about a good young up and coming scholar in the game at Yale, Monica C. Bell. Shout out to her piece, Anti-Segregation Policing. We also did a piece on, we discussed Artika Tainera and Darlene Fry's Iron Shackles to Invisible Chains last week. Dr. Hassim Kambui on reparations, the Afrocentric plan. And in previous weeks, Sean L. Gabadon, Marley Madera, Cecil Hunt has a great piece out right now. Camille Gear-Rich, right? This is the second time in a month. About 3 weeks ago, we did her Contracting Our Way to Inequality, Race, Reproductive Freedom, and the Quest for the Perfect Child. In previous weeks, we were doing Pauline Kim has a new article out in the Virginia Law Review, Deborah Hellman. Oh, the 21st Century Synthesis. Undoing the 20th Century Synthesis. From Jedediah Britton Purdy, David Singer Wall, Amy Kapczynski, K. Sabeel Rahmana, right? So some excellent pieces we've done. Denise Berry, Andre Perry, Jill Watts, and of course the great Sandy Darity, Charles Lawrence. So every week we're putting out three different reviewing or digesting three pieces that have been published in law reviews all around the country, so that you can see what's going out now and how it relates to racial economic justice, how situations today are not just indignifying, not just deprivations of liberty, but basically will, in the long run, and perhaps even the short run, but in the long run, will exacerbate the racial wealth gap by maintaining, creating, or exacerbating racially asymmetric market imperfections. All right, we ready to talk about the paper specifically? All right, so let's talk Shreya Subramani, CUNY. Productive separations, emergent governance of reentry labor. Now, Professor Subramani, as I looked up, is a professor of law and society at CUNY. She has a PhD from Princeton. And I'm going to guess that some of this comes from her PhD work, where she just received her PhD not too long ago, more than 3 years ago. This is very heavy in sociological vernacular, so we got to twist it. So I'm going to have to convert it to from sociology to legalese, and then to the language of critical race law and economics, as I'm going to call it, right? So here's a piece from her paper. This ethnographic essay critiques progressive criminal justice reforms as neoliberal technologies that devalue racialized labor within the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Let me say that again. This ethnographic essay critiques progressive criminal justice reforms as neoliberal technologies that devalue racialized labor within the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. It begins by describing the emergent reentry space, a proliferating network of policy programming emerging to manage and provide services for formerly incarcerated people returning to the city. Reentry is framed as a way to reinvest state and city resources, and is also explicitly described as a project toward racial equality through decarceration. But Professor Subramani's ethnography of the reentry space demonstrates that the problematic deferral of racial justice through the new governance practices, we put that up there, the new governance practices of carceral reform programs, by analyzing the aspirations and practices of an experimental reentry alternative sentencing court and a municipal labor training network for reentrants, it traces how such reform programs depend on an ideological delineation between the market and on the one hand and carcerality on the other. By mobilizing the analytic of racial capitalism, shout out to Cedric Robinson, this essay argues that racialized inequality is constitutive of economic markets through the capital carceral circulations of people, labor, and value. The differential deployment of carceral punishment that disproportionately impacts poor communities of color and the devaluation of racialized labor are coextensive phenomena that emerge as novel configurations with the experimental criminal justice reform. All right, now I'm going to break it down the way I see it, but I'm just going to give just one more paragraph coming directly from Professor Subramani before I give my comments. Let me put that up there. In the words of legal scholar Carl Takai, these left-right reform efforts risk creating a nightmare scenario of mass control, surveillance, and monitoring of Black and brown communities. The long histories of the surveillance and criminalization of Blackness are thus reconfigured and recast in novel modalities through a seemingly progressive agenda towards racial justice. The liberal initiatives in the U.S. attended to racial inequality can set the grounds to expand the reach of the racialized carceral state. All right. Well, I'm going to say that is a very deep and sociological, with sociological vernacular, sociological way to basically describe what Derek Bell called interest convergence theory, right? Interest convergence theory is more than just the idea that people with the same interests can work together and people with different interests don't work together. More specifically, Derek Bell's point was that civil rights progress advances when it is only when it is also in the interest of elite whites, right? So we can tease interest convergence out to many other constructs and many other situations. We can talk about how in any situation, two people cooperating need to have the same interests, and people working against each other don't. However, interest convergence theory is a little more specific than that, in that the interest that matters when it comes to civil rights law, right? Not that it ought to be, but when we talk about racial realism, the interest that matter is elite white. So it is no surprise under an interest convergence theory rubric that progressive policy reforms will be co-opted into interest to serve the interests of elite whites. And so again, I recast this in terms of racial asymmetric market perfections thus far. A sociologic restatement of interest convergence theory. This warns that progressive law enforcement programs will be co-opted to favor the interests of elite whites. Professor Subramani identifies the connection between criminal law enforcement penalties as racially asymmetrically distributed transaction costs and the long-run effect of those penalties as racially asymmetric market competition to the extent they hamper our earning ability of the reentry worker while at the same time providing a mechanism to depressing wages generally, upon which people of color disproportionately rely on relative to capital accumulation. So in other words, again, these are great progressive ideas, right, on how to decarcerate. However, to the extent they still disproportionately place the specter on black and brown people, and those penalties still hamper them from re-entering the labor market in the way that they ought to be, it is still a means to devalue. It's still a way in which that labor is devalued. And it is also, again, she's also criticizing the separation of the prison labor market or prison at all from the labor market, when we know, going all the way back, if we use Douglas Blackman, Slavery by Another Name, or any of the other books on convict leasing, that prison labor and the threat of prison has always been a way to enforce labor market compliance, especially when it comes to low-end job scales. All right. So, great paper, Shreya, Subramani, Productive Separations, Emergent Governance of Reentry Labor, Fordham Urban Law Review. All right, now, I couldn't wait to get this one. Catherine Powell, Camille Gear-Rich, right? Catherine Powell is out Fordham. I think a lot of people are now familiar with her because she just recently put an op-ed in, was it the New York Times, I believe, talking about the racial disproportional detriment of COVID-19. Well, this is some more serious, highly published in highly ranked journals here. In the Georgetown Law Review, entitled "The Welfare Queen." Oh, and I'm sorry, Camille Gear-Rich, who I just mentioned 10 minutes ago, also published on reproductive contracts and reproductive freedoms and race about a month ago, or we featured it about a month ago. Well, they got a dub plate together, right? Right, Funkmaster Flex, the sirens and all that. Fire, new dub plate on the scene. The Welfare Queen goes to the polls. Race-based fractures in gender politics and opportunities for intersectional coalitions. 108th volume of the Georgetown Law Journal, page 105, 2020. Here's a piece. I'm sorry, I got to give you a good, strong snippet from the paper before I give my impression or characterization of it in terms of racially asymmetric market imperfections. All right, so they start off. We take as our object the 2016 presidential election and its aftermath. For in 2016, then presidential candidate Donald Trump and his surrogates reanimated the welfare queen construct and alleged that she was stealing American democracy through voter fraud. The visceral power of this construct allowed this group of Republicans to transform Americans' understanding of voting rights and American democracy. In so doing, their representation simultaneously sidetracked feminist efforts to build strong cross-racial coalitions, right? Because to the extent that was believed, like more than 50% of white women did vote and fight for Donald Trump. This article explores the various paths out of our current discourse, dispelling the distracting haze generated by the welfare queen construction. In the process, we also hope to advance our conceptual understanding of intersectional identities and their relationship to political change. All right, more from the paper. Although the roots of today's welfare queen construct can be most directly traced to the late 20th century, the voter trickster trope of the 19th Amendment's pre-ratification period offers an important historical antecedent, because remember, we always got to remember, black men received the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. Black women did not get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment, right? And both of them are under attack now because of the Voting Rights Act, right? Hence, we suggest that once women understand how the political trickster construct has been used as a distraction historically, they will be empowered in multiple ways. For one, the historical understanding could help feminists reground intersectional coalitions in a thicker rights framework, as 19th Amendment suffragists Francis E.W. Harper and Frederick Douglass did in the 19th century. This thicker human rights framework emphasizes one, intersectional rights and identities, as black suffragists did nearly a century before them. The term intersectionality was even coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, for those that don't know. Two, the unalienable nature of fundamental rights, such as the right to vote regardless of the state's formal recognition of such rights. And three, a more robust notion of rights that recognizes how rights like voting are made particularly meaningful by being embedded in a particular social and collective context. All right. Now, just a little bit more from the paper before I give you the economic spin on it. Just as the welfare queen's demands for social safety nets and reproductive freedom for poor women are cast as a threat to American society, the so-called voter fraudsters' demands for easy, open, and simple ways to exercise the franchise is transformed into a threat of democratic order rather than seen as a path to full and equal democratic participation. Indeed, both the welfare queen and the voter trickster figure provide opportunities to rethink the rules of democratic engagement and the opportunities we afford marginalized figures to articulate a legislative agenda and constitutional rights claims. On the whole, we seek to deepen possibilities for cross-racial coalition and law reform, highlighting the role that the internet could play in these coalitions. We conclude with an argument about regrounding our understanding of intersectionality in a human rights frame. Again, Camille Gear-Rich, Catherine Powell, Fordham and USC together, got both coasts rocking it out. Now, from an economic perspective, from a neoclassical market structure, or how does this black welfare queen and voter suppression denigrate an otherwise or idyllic free market? How does it perpetuate the racial wealth gap? Well, first of all, we have Powell and Gear-Rich describe how racially asymmetric market imperfection, in terms of the myth of black inferiority, specifically the trope of the welfare queen and political trickster, relate to and perpetuate racially asymmetric transaction costs and externalities by way of voter suppression. In other words, the black welfare queen, if information is supposed to be perfect, right, we know that it's imperfect, and we also know that the trope of the black welfare queen is what also makes it racially asymmetric, right? And then that leading over to voter suppression, that voter suppression is adding costs onto the activity of voting. More than that, as government and therefore elections ultimately determine the structure of the marketplace, racially asymmetric transaction costs relating to voting perpetuate asymmetrical market failure generally and comprehensively. To the extent public choice theory conceives of a market for law and regulation, voter suppression reflects racially asymmetric competition in terms of racial political capital gaps, right? So, great paper on feminism, the myth of black inferiority, welfare queens, and voter suppression, tying it all together, right? And that's especially what we're trying to do here, show how racially subordinating circumstances are all tied together. In my way, we point it towards the racial wealth gap. Others may point towards the indignity of it all. To each his own, right? Here at the Economic Justice Law Review, obviously our focus is economics. So wonderful paper again by Camille Gear-Rich and Catherine Powell. The welfare queen goes to the polls. Our last piece is equally as dope, informative, and absolutely perfectly timed. The last one is absolutely timed because we're talking about the primaries and the national election in 2020 in November. This is right in the wheelhouse of the protests over George Floyd, over Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Let's talk about Michael Siegel, Racial Disparities in Fatal Police Shootings, an empirical analysis informed by critical race theory, in the 100th volume of the Boston University Law Review, page 1069. Let me give you a little piece. I mean, it's so dope. I got to give you a little piece out of this. This research is not, while it's published in the law school, Michael Siegel, from my understanding, is in the Boston University Department of Public Health. Right? So he's a public health professor and researcher who has published this within the law journal. Although the use of excessive force by police has been a concern within communities of color for decades, the issue recently reached the public consciousness through media coverage of a number of high-profile police killings of unarmed Black victims. In explaining these events, the common understanding has been that there are some bad apples among police forces who exert excessive force due to personal conscious bias or implicit racial bias. Right? We just talked about Charles Lawrence's review of Jennifer Eberhardt's book on implicit bias, right? The most widespread institutional response has been the implementation of implicit bias trainings and the use of body cameras to shape and monitor individual police-citizen interactions. This essay adopts a different perspective. Using critical race theory and the public health critical race praxis, it asks a novel set of questions regarding the marked racial disparities in police violence. In particular, it attempts to explain the striking differences in the magnitude of racial disparities in fatal police shootings across states and major U.S. cities. The essay reviews research that examines structural racism as a possible explanation for the disparities in racial disparities across spaces, and considers the potential role of racially identified spaces in molding the way police officers perceive not only individuals, but also entire neighborhoods. It concludes that individual level interventions cannot adequately address racial disparities and fatal police violence, and that confronting and remedying the consequences of a long history of racial residential segregation and structural racism is necessary, right? So again, so basically it's just saying what we've all said, symbolic gestures, including training and whatnot, they are trained, they know how to treat white victims or white perpetrators or offenders, right? Doesn't need to be retrained, needs a different mentality, and that different mentality will only come from a fairer and more meritocratic structure. We'll keep going a little further. Between 2013 and 2018, there were a total of 6,176 fatal police shootings in the United States. Of the 5,700 shootings in which the race of the victim was known, 1,565, or 27.5%, over a quarter, included Black victims, representing more than twice the proportion of Blacks in the overall population, which is only 13%. At the crudest level, racial disparities in police violence are explained by a bad apple theory of violence, which holds that the inappropriate behavior of a small number of police officers is responsible. At a more evidence-based level, racial disparities in police violence are explained largely by implicit racial bias on the part of police officers more generally. And here we go, let's round it out. The hallmark of the nation's response to racial bias in police shootings has also been focused at the individual level. The use of body cameras and the implementation of implicit bias training have been the most common responses. For example, in 2018, New York City spent $4.5 million to provide implicit bias training to all police officers. Fair and Impartial Policing, LLC, the company that is that Black-owned? I don't think so. The company that provided the training is a private organization that has conducted thousands of implicit bias trainings with city, state, regional, and university police agencies throughout the country. At least one state makes implicit basic bias training mandatory for police officers. Great stuff, right? Well, a Minnesota statute enacted in 2017 requires implicit bias training, and this was after the Philando Castile shooting. Well, what are the results? Implicit bias trainings have received so much attention that a single study compared the effectiveness of 17 different implicit racial bias interventions, 17 of them. None of them were consistently effective, right? So that is the paper by Michael Siegel, Racial Disparities in Fatal Police Shootings and Empirical Analysis. Now, it's interesting because when we talk about racism and as economic justice, we often think, or at least I will typically concede, that violence, especially when it comes to rape, when it comes to police shooting, they might be demeaned by an economic analysis. And yet, I still think it's important because the circumstances are so debilitating and they affect Black people so much that we can't help but note how it will influence how Black people operate in the marketplace to begin. So from the very top, the police killings, police extrajudicial killings or police murders of Black folks clearly discourage Black people from just participating in society and the marketplace entirely, that this place is not for us, right? And that can be described in terms of asymmetrical profit maximization, the tendency for Black folks to withdraw from the market, to refuse to engage with the market because of racism. That's in addition to folks excluding us from the market entirely, right? Okay, so it also more directly, that's indirect, and more directly, whatever crime was committed, if there was a crime at all, police killings, police brutality represent a higher cost that Black people have to pay to engage in either illicit transactions, or if you're Breonna Taylor, that's the price she had to pay to get some sleep in her own house, that other people can just pay the rent. We have to pay the rent, get a dog, car, gun, boyfriend or girlfriend, anti-police. Remember the Batman anti-shark repellent? I don't know. We have to get all types of costs together and pay time, money, and resources to avoid getting killed by the cops, and it still may happen. So police shootings also reflect more directly asymmetrically distributed transaction costs and societal externalities upon Black folks, right? So those are our three very good, very, very, very well done papers dealing with race, economics, and the law, even if they didn't intend specifically to talk about race, economics, and the law, because any racially subordinating circumstance can be recharacterized in terms of the way in which it creates, maintains, or exacerbates racially asymmetric market imperfections. So those are our three papers for this week. Let me go over them one more time. We talked about, or we presented Shreya Subramani, Productive Separations, Emerging Governance of Reentry Labor in the Fordham Urban Law Journal. Secondly, powerhouses Catherine Powell and Camille Gear-Rich, The Welfare Queen Goes to the Polls, in the 108th volume of the Georgetown Law Journal. And then finally, Michael Siegel's Racial Disparities and Fatal Police Shootings, an Empirical Analysis Informed by Critical Race Theory in the Boston University Law Review. So next week, we will be back with three more pieces. And if you haven't noticed, you've seen the little banners. We're trying to get a little fly with the technology. And what this technology, StreamYard, allows us to do is also bring other people on the screen from remote places. So you will hear from me. If you've published anything good lately, you're going to hear from me as far as being interviewed, so you can talk more specifically about your paper on this particular program, and we can talk about how it relates to or exacerbates the racial wealth gap, how it affects racial economic justice. Until then, Andre Smith, Smitty Bonton, Cash Rules.